Michel Foucault has had a huge impact on the way we think about science and society. He is perhaps best known for his analysis of power, which we will talk about in another lecture. But his approach to the history of science, and especially his analysis of that history in terms of what he calls epistemes, has also been very influential. And that's what we will focus on today. Just like Kuhn, Foucault believes that the history of science is not one single smooth trajectory towards more and more knowledge. Instead, there are sudden changes, sudden ruptures. As we know, Kuhn understood these sudden changes in terms of paradigm shifts, when the background assumptions of a science are switched for different ones almost overnight. Foucault's idea about the history of science is at the same time very similar and very different. It is very similar because just like Kuhn, he believes that big ruptures occur when certain background assumptions are changed. Foucault calls the sum of these assumptions an episteme, and a casual reader might think that that is just a different word for paradigm. But in reality, Foucault's concept of an episteme is also very different from Kuhn's concept of a paradigm. In order to understand Foucault, we need to understand this difference. So, what is an episteme? Before we answer that question, we first need to discuss the way in which Foucault approaches history. According to Foucault, all of us, including historians, have a tendency to put way too much emphasis on the subject, that is, on the individual human being and her beliefs, desires, decisions, and so on. For instance, if we want to explain why Germany lost the Second World War, we tend to favor explanations in terms of the decisions made by important leaders like Hitler and Churchill. Germany lost the war because Hitler suffered from a mental breakdown and started making foolish decisions. That's the kind of theory that we can easily comprehend and that we find satisfying. But it might not be the best explanation. Would Germany really have won with a different leader? Perhaps there were large-scale economic, geographical and political facts which basically predetermined that Germany would lose. Maybe no individual, not even Hitler, made that much of a difference to the outcome. Explanations in terms of such impersonal forces can feel abstract and unsatisfying, but they might be closer to the truth than explanations in terms of individual subjects. Now, the same thing might be true in the history of science. We like to talk about individual geniuses like Newton, Darwin, Freud, or Foucault. But perhaps the course of science is not determined by such individuals, but by large-scale processes and tendencies in science itself and in society at large. Perhaps our science would have been pretty much the same if Newton, Darwin, Freud and Foucault had never lived. Foucault would agree with that. But he doesn't just want to move away from the individual subject to explanations that are at a larger scale, involving groups of individuals. He wants to move away entirely from the level of the consciousness of subjects. Well, what does that mean? At the level of our conscious thinking, we have certain beliefs and desires, and we make decisions based on those. Historians of science, Foucault points out, have mostly been interested in these conscious phenomena. We want to know why Darwin believed certain things, what his arguments for those beliefs were, why he decided to publish them when he did, what other people then thought about them, and so on. When we write a history of science, we will mostly focus on these conscious aspects. But for Foucault, that is a problem. By focusing on the things that people are conscious of, we miss the most important stuff, the unconscious rules that determine how we think and write and act. Let's consider that for a moment. If you want to understand why people behave in a certain way, it is of course important to know about their conscious beliefs and desires and decisions. I am making this film about Foucault because I have decided to do so. And I made the decision because I believe Foucault is a very interesting thinker and you should know something about his work. But if you want to understand why people behave in a certain way, it is also important, and maybe even more important, to look at the unconscious rules that govern our behavior. There are all kinds of rules, for instance, that determine which thoughts we take seriously enough to really consider, and which ones we don't. Before making this film, I made a conscious decision about which shirt to wear. But I did not make the conscious decision to wear a shirt rather than appear completely naked. Why? Well, it never occurred to me that I could go here naked. And if it had occurred to me, I would have dismissed that thought without really considering it. Why? Because there is a cultural rule against nakedness that is incorporated so deeply into my mind that it affects me even when I'm not consciously thinking about it. According to Foucault, something like this is also going on in science. In every society and in every period of time, there are unconscious rules that determine what kinds of discourse, that is, what kinds of speech or writing, are taken seriously in science. The vast majority of the time, scientists aren't even aware of these rules, but they do determine what is and what is not discussed in any scientific period. These rules are what Foucault calls an episteme. So an episteme is a set of unconscious rules that govern all serious scientific discourse in a certain society and time period and determine what does and does not get taken seriously by that scientific community. Here's an example. A popular kind of book in the Middle Ages was the bestiary, an often beautifully illustrated collection of descriptions of animals. These descriptions were often copy-pasted from different sources, including the Bible, ancient authors and more recent reports, with almost no critical fact-checking. One major aim of many bestiary authors was to draw a moral or religious lesson from every animal, because the idea was that the animal kingdom illustrated God's intentions for mankind. These bestiaries were taken seriously as sources of what we can anachronistically call scientific knowledge in the Middle Ages. But they would not be taken seriously by a modern scientist. The rules of the medieval episteme allow, perhaps even encourage, the scientist to copy his knowledge from famous authors and to draw moral lessons from nature. The rules of the modern episteme, on the other hand, require all knowledge to be based on critically examined observation reports and require a strict distinction between science and moralizing. A modern biologist wouldn't even think about drawing a moral lesson from an animal, whereas the medieval author sees this as perhaps his most important task. Wouldn't even think about it. That's the phrase that Foucault wants to emphasize. The episteme determines what thoughts we take seriously enough to really think about. We can now see the important differences between an episteme and a paradigm. First, a paradigm consists of stuff that a scientist is conscious of. Theories, methods, concepts, instruments, and so on. It's the stuff we are working with. An episteme, on the other hand, involves rules that are so deeply ingrained in our thinking that we are hardly aware of them. Biologists don't think about how they're not allowed to draw moral lessons. They just don't draw moral lessons. Second, a paradigm is specific to a single scientific discipline. There's a paradigm in linguistics and a very different paradigm in art history. Or maybe there's even a paradigm of historical linguistics and a paradigm of sociolinguistics and so on. But an episteme is much broader. It encompasses all the scientists. If biologists are allowed to draw moral lessons from nature, then so are ethnographers and physicists and so on. Third, paradigms don't have to be all that long-lived. During a turbulent period, maybe there could be several paradigm shifts in a century within a single scientific discipline. Epistemes, on the other hand, change very rarely. According to Foucault, there have been just 3 epistemes in European science in the past 500 years. As you can imagine, when an episteme does change, the impact on science will be huge. In every science at once, the very rules that determine which ideas and theories are taken seriously will change. Foucault claims that this happened around 1600 and again around 1800. And if we look at something like the medieval bestiary and compare it to a current textbook on, say, evolutionary biology, we can imagine how huge those changes must have been. And who knows, maybe another change of episteme lies just around the corner.